have, thank you. We've got a good long program this evening with a lot of action opportunities. So please be aware of those as we go through the program and look for those opportunities that we can all use in the most difficult situation that we find ourselves in. Well, not ourselves, but the folks in Europe. And obviously with the things that have been said about nuclear power, this is a desperate time to be understanding what we can do. I'm Lisa Franzen. I'm the chapter leader of PDA Central New Mexico. The Progressive Democrats of America was formed in 2004 by our founder and friend, Tim Carpenter, with the idea that we would work inside and outside the Democratic Party when necessary. And we do find that to be necessary at times. We have 6 strong pillars, what we call our organizing teams, which give us a lot of direction into the things that we care about, the things that we study, the things that we look for possibilities for. One is clean, fair, transparent elections. Big issue that that Paul Stokes has worked on for years here in New Mexico, and we can see the results of that work. We've got stop global warming and the environment, big issues that we're dealing with there. End corporate rule, economic and social justice, and I'll end with the 2 that are most connected to what we'll be discussing tonight and listening to and learning tonight. That's in wars and occupations, and the healthcare for all, single payer, and we say healthcare, not warfare. So we are deep into these issues and always need to learn more, always need to know where we can get more opportunities to be active. So I want to pass this on at this point to Charles Powell from the group that is very strongly working with the in wars and occupations, and he is going to acknowledge our dear friend Herb Hoffman. So Charles, would you take it on, please, my friend?
First of all, show you the status of the conflict. We're close to 2 weeks into it. The areas marked in red are controlled by Russian forces.
Unmute. Are you muted? I'm seeing a mute.
I don't know how I got muted.
There you are, buddy. Good to see you, my friend.
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. And I appreciate being asked to make some remarks about our dear friend and colleague, Herbert Hoffman. Herb passed away on March 4th. Herb was 89. He had been the father of 2, but he lost his daughter just months before his own passing. So he has a son that remains and also a granddaughter. He retired from a career as an academic and clinical psychologist. Am I muted?
No, I can hear you.
I've got something telling me I'm muted.
I hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. I first met Herb at Veterans for Peace national conventions. Veterans for Peace have their conventions at different cities around the country. And I started seeing Herb at those conventions. So I knew him before he came to Albuquerque. He had been involved with Veterans for Peace Chapter 1, which is in Portland, Maine, is where our organization was first founded. And Herb had been active with them as well as some of the other chapters on the East Coast. I'm sorry, I'm losing myself. Herb was always ready to step up and step in and do what was necessary to help, whatever it was, whenever it was. When I burned out as president of our local chapter of Veterans for Peace, and the young man that took over after me moved to New Zealand, it was her that stepped up and became the president of our chapter. And even after he had left the area because of the illness of his daughter, he continued to be active with our chapter. In fact, even up till the end, he had remained chapter performing duties as a president by Zoom. He was always cool, calm, articulate, and persuasive. He's going to be missed. Close to Herb's heart was Veterans for Peace, progressive politics, activism. I mentioned to my friend Haya Ross the other day that up until the end, Herb had been very busy on Zoom, attending meetings and events, BFP Zooms, PDA Zooms, Healthcare Not Warfare Zooms, Stop War and End Occupation Zooms, Zooms to support Sally Alice Thompson, Zooms to support himself, Herb. He even testified by Zoom before the Connecticut legislature on compassionate choices. This was something that was dear to his heart, and he felt important enough that when they were considering the measure in their legislature, he talked before them. He did leave this world on his own terms, choosing the place and the time. He departed on March 4th, comfortably and peacefully surrounded by family, and he is missed.
Thank you, Charles, for that beautiful set of comments about our Dr. Herb Hoffman. Many people remember him and all of his good work, so thank you for that, Charles. Lloyd, I think you're up.
Yes, thank you, Karen. I just want to give a couple of tech tips for enjoying tonight's Zoom meeting. Please mute yourself unless you're speaking. And then also, as the speakers that are presenting tonight are presenting, if you have any questions, please put your questions into the Zoom chat window, and please prefix them with the letter Q or a question mark so we know that they're a question rather than a comment so that we can get to them. So I'm going to hand it back over to you, Karen, for land acknowledgement.
Okay. Bye.
Great, thank you. Welcome, friends who are joining. Please make sure you're muted if you're not speaking. We thank you for that. And again, I'm Karen Bentrup, part of PDA Planning. And tonight I have the honor to invite all into recognition and appreciation of the indigenous peoples and nations on whose land the United States resides. And that each and all of us who are not native to this land have a responsibility to expand our understandings. In this land acknowledgement for tonight, and that we are in the month celebrating women, I want to expand outward from New Mexico, where I am located at the moment in unceded Tiwa territory, to the larger land around us, that which is colonially known as the Western Hemisphere. Remembering that all directional names, like Western, are relative to the speaker. So this name, Western Hemisphere, comes from Europeans gazing west. This land has been known for many thousands of years as Turtle Island by the indigenous people who lived here first. And this month is Women's History Month for the United States, and I appreciate the writer Bridget Quinn for reminding me how much U.S. women owe to the indigenous women of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So this is a fantastic book called She Votes, where Bridget Quinn describes a lot of information, and Lloyd's going to be dropping into the chat links for some of these resources and for some actions that we can take. So this is she votes. And the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the longest thriving democracy on Turtle Island and possibly in the entire world. And one of the key features is that they always had equal rights for women in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it's likely that the American women from New York to the Dakotas had eyes to see that there were equal rights on this land, just not for them. They saw that the Native women had what they did not: agency, property, and power. So it's likely the Seneca women of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy inspired white women to take up the mantle of women's rights at Seneca Falls. So to honor the original women of Turtle Island who had equal rights, and to finally bring equal rights to all women here on this land, get us the ERA now. So in January of this year, the ERA has been ratified. It is law. It should be certified and published by the archivist. So there's a couple of actions that all of us can take to bring equality for all the women living on this land, Native and immigrant alike. We need to fully recognize the 28th Amendment and have equal rights for all of us. So dropping into the chat are a couple of actions that we can take. We need to contact and demand that the archivist publish the ERA as the 28th Amendment. We can contact the president. All of this is dropping into the chat, and your members of Congress, both in the Senate and the House. We can also contact Attorney General Merrick Garland and invite him to withdraw his predecessor's memo to the archivist regarding the publication of the fully ratified ERA, and the Department of Justice comment line is dropping into the chat. So tonight we honor and acknowledge the land that we are on. Again, I am standing on unceded Tiwa territory here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and we're expanding that to recognize our thanks to the women of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy who mentored for us and showed us what equal rights looks like for women. So thank you all for taking actions to bring equal rights for Native and immigrant women here on this land. Thank you. Tonight, we're going to shift into our program now. Thank you so much, into our main keynote speaker program. And for each of our two keynote speakers, because on a Zoom, it can kind of get a little wobbly, I'm going to be timekeeping for both of our keynote speakers. So as I'm assisting them with that timekeeping, you may hear my voice gently come into the last minute of their talk, letting them know that they are at their last minute. So thank you all so much for being here at PDA, and we're ready for you, Paul Stokes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Karen. I am the one of the co-state coordinators for our chapter, and oh, you're not hearing? Are you not hearing me?
I hear you.
Me?
I hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
We hear you.
Okay. And I just lost something that I needed to read from, so I got to get that back. Here we go. And so thanks, Karen, and hello to everyone, and welcome to everyone. You're in for a special evening tonight with Archbishop Wester and Jay Coghlan's presentations on the importance of nuclear disarmament. And now, because of the horrible situation in Ukraine, this topic has gained increased relevance. And because of its history, New Mexicans themselves have a special responsibility to address the dangers of nuclear weapons. But before we get into all that, as I'm happen to be one of the founders, as well as the co-state coordinator for our chapter of PDA, and I'd like to give you just a quick snapshot of PDA's involvement in arms control. Lisa mentioned, went through all our 6 fundamental values, and she pointed out that ending wars and occupations is one of those, and that's where our arms control activities are focused. So as part of the Ending Wars and Occupations National Group, our New Mexico team working in this area has recently been alerting New Mexicans to the dangers of fabricating even more of these nuclear weapons. For me personally, I consider myself lucky for being able to work on nuclear arms control for most of my working life. So I was heartened when reading the Archbishop's recent story in Time magazine that he credited arms control as the only proven historical solution to an arms race, and that we should invest in the verification of compliance with arms control treaty obligations. And I would add that you can't have one of those without the other. So a couple of examples of my own experience in those areas. Beginning way back in the 60s and continuing through the 90s, our team developed the technologies and methods to verify compliance with a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, a precursor, you might say, to the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. And in a completely different arms control regime, we developed and deployed in the Soviet Union, now Russia, a system of continuous on-site monitoring of a missile production plant to verify compliance with the treaty to eliminate all intermediate range nuclear armed missiles that were deployed in Europe and the Soviet Union until the late 1980s. So that's what we techies can do to further arms control. But it's the moral dimension of nuclear weapons that drives such technical work, and that's what's really important, and that's what you are about to hear from the Archbishop and from Jay Coghlan. So now I'd like to hand the mic over to Kathleen O'Malley, who will be introducing our speakers. Kathleen?
Thank you. I am very pleased and very excited to introduce Archbishop John C. Years ago, before the Archbishop moved to New Mexico, his reputation preceded him. He is a true religious leader, committed to social justice, with a commitment also to the immigrants. Now, I know that's not our topic tonight, but I think telling a little bit about him and his commitment tells something about who he is. I was very involved with the immigrants and with immigrant issues. And especially at the time that an Iraqi man who had lived here for years and in fact worked for the US military, but was being deported. It was that time when so many Iraqis or Muslims were being deported from this country. And I knew, having spent a lot of time in Iraq during the war years, what would happen if he was deported there was very likely that he would be killed. So our organization, the Coalition, Faith Coalition of Immigrant Justice, decided to provide Kadam with sanctuary. This was not an easy task, and we wanted to publicize what we were doing and letting people know the importance of this idea of sanctuary and of protecting this man. And the group, again, the Faith Coalition of Immigrant Justice, decided to publicize what we were doing and give a press conference. So I approached the Archbishop, who didn't know me and didn't know of our organization nor Kadam. And he agreed to actually speak at our press conference. Not only that, when Kadam actually decided to turn himself in and be detained and sent back to Iraq, the day that he approached the Department of Homeland Security to do that, there were over 100 of us standing outside in support of him and of course to protest this horrible policy. And Archbishop C.Wester stood there with us. So I know again that this is not on this topic, but it tells you something about our speaker, what kind of person he is and how committed he is to justice. It makes me proud to know him and very glad to introduce him to you all. So Archbishop, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Malley. I'm very grateful to you, and I'm grateful to all of you for this very kind and gracious invitation. And I am honored. And I'm also honored to be presenting with Mr. Jay Coghlan, a wonderful, I count him now as a friend, and he's mentoring me in this whole area of nuclear disarmament, and I am very honored to be with him. I'd like to say from the outset that obviously you might tell by the way I'm dressed that I'm obviously representing a certain tradition, a certain faith, the Catholic Christian faith. But, and I'll be speaking from that perspective, but I really do believe that this, what I'm about to say, I think is something that all people of goodwill have agreement with, the gospel and the witness of Jesus Christ in our world. People of different faiths, other faiths, non-Christian faiths, or no faith at all. I think that there is a lot of a synergy around these themes. And a lot of what I'm about to say and it really does relate to the common good. And this is a very important pillar of Catholic social justice teaching, the common good, what we do for the common good. And so all human beings and to acknowledge the goodness in human beings. And so I'd like to say that from the outset. So basically, I want to begin in a way, I'm kind of reprising the pastoral letter that we put out on January 11th of this year. And I came to Santa Fe in 2015. I was installed on June the 4th, 2015, coming from Utah. And I came here to beautiful Santa Fe. I have a very dear friend of mine, a Spanish lady. And when she gives me her full name, it takes about 5 minutes to say it all. It's a very long, she's so proud of each and every one of those names. Well, the real name of Santa Fe is La Villa Real de la Santa Fe de San Francisco de Asís, the royal town of the Holy Faith of St. Francis of Assisi. And of course, this connects it very intimately with peace. Francis, again, is somebody who is very well loved by many throughout the world. A man of peace. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. And so with this in mind, I think in the back of my head, in 2017, I went to Japan with the two bishop friends of mine. And of course, in the course of our time there, 10 days in Japan, we went to Hiroshima and to Nagasaki. And I still remember those visits. It was a somber visit, and it changed our visit, our vacation very much, of course. Witnessing in the different displays and museums and talking to people, the human suffering that happened in that fateful day, the days in 1945. I was especially disturbed when I read about the school children who were attracted to the bright light that was through their windows, and they ran to the windows to see the bright light. In our Christian faith, Catholic Christian faith, Christ is the light of the world. The light that pierces the darkness, the light that brings new life. That light in 1945 was obscene and anything but life-giving. Then sometime later, I was in Santa Fe and some friends had come to visit. And so I took them to some of the museums in Santa Fe. And while there in the New Mexico History Museum, we saw the display of the Manhattan Project, the main production of which, as you know, took place in the Los Alamos Labs. And I found it a very chilling experience, having been to Japan, and then the contrast to see the beginning of all this and then the result of all this in Japan. And I realized that there was a time in my life when I might have been first impressed with American ingenuity, or I might have been impressed with science or with the ability of human beings to create these kinds of wonders, really, in a way. But that wasn't my impression at all. It was rather one of depression, of sadness, and realizing the human suffering that these bombs caused. And I realize you can look at these bombings from a different points of view, technology, history, and all of this. But as a pastor, I looked at it from the point of view of human suffering. War and violence are always horrific. But atomic weapons are in a completely different category that makes them unacceptable in and of themselves. And imagining those who perished in Japan almost 77 years ago, I could almost hear their screams and their cries of pain. I was reminded of T.S. Eliot's famous line from the Four Quartets, "What the dead had no speech for when living, they can tell you, being dead. The communication of the dead is tongued with fire, beyond the language of the living." This is my perspective. I am a pastor. I am called to listen to people, especially those who are suffering. and to listen to those who've already gone before us. I remember a quote from G.K. Chesterton. He once said that tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. Those of us who happen to be walking about have created a nuclear arsenal throughout the world that can destroy our planet many times over. It seems to me that we must give those who died in Japan a vote. We need to listen to them. For me, this has to do with the sanctity of human life. We are created in the image of God. God gave us life and has given us the ability, the capacity to enhance and embellish and augment that life. We also have the capacity to destroy life, and never as effectively as nuclear arms make possible. Pope Francis, in his encyclical Laudato Si, has called on the world to care for our common home. One of the best ways to care for our home, for ourselves, is to rid the world of nuclear weapons. I recognize this is a complicated, challenging, and confounding goal. However, the moral imperative demands that we achieve this goal as soon as possible. It is blasphemous for human beings to assume divine prerogatives. Only God can give us our lives and our common home. And for us to build weapons that can destroy it by the push of a button is the ultimate sin of an ungrateful humanity. The current tragedy unfolding in Ukraine underscores the urgency of this quest. That is why, with the help of some very dedicated people, I published my pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament. In it, I attempt to encourage a conversation, a dialogue that would move our world closer to complete and verifiable nuclear disarmament. Our Catholic tradition in the form of pastoral teaching has a long and rich history of speaking out against nuclear arms, as you all do too in your group, in your coalition, and so many others throughout the United States. In Gaudium et Spes, the Vatican II documents way back into the mid-1960s, it said that the arms race in which an already considerable number of countries are engaged is not a safe way to preserve a steady peace, nor is the so-called balance resulting from this race a sure and authentic peace. Rather than being eliminated thereby, the causes of war are in danger of being gradually aggravated. While extravagant sums are being spent for the furnishing of ever new weapons, an adequate remedy cannot be provided for the multiple miseries afflicting the whole human modern world. The arms race is an utterly treacherous trap for humanity and one which ensnares the poor to an intolerable degree. I think Paul gave good witness to that in his introductory remarks. Pope St. John the 23rd said that nuclear weapons must be banned. This goes way back to the 60s as well. True and lasting peace among nations cannot consist in the possession of an equal supply of armaments, but only on mutual trust. That was from Pacem et Terris. Pope St. John Paul II said that the constant concern and consistent efforts of the Catholic Church will not cease until there is a general verifiable disarmament, until the hearts of all are won over to these ethical choices, which will guarantee lasting peace. And Pope Benedict, in his World Day of Peace message on January 1st, 2006, said much the same thing. How can there ever be a future of peace when investments are still made in the production of arms and in research aimed at developing new ones? Now, throughout these documents, the church, our church, has always held out the moral possibility of deterrence. When the bishops of the United States had their peace document many decades ago, they also provided for deterrence. They provided a pathway for deterrence. But there was a significant change in our Catholic Christian teaching, which came about in 2015 under the pontificate of Pope Francis. The Holy See made a statement in 2015 and said that it must be admitted that the very possession of nuclear weapons, even for purposes of deterrence, is morally problematic. While a consensus continues to grow that any possible use of such weapons is radically inconsistent with the demands of human dignity, In the past, the church has nonetheless expressed a provisional acceptance for their possession for reasons of deterrence, under the condition that this be a step on the way towards progressive disarmament. This condition has not been fulfilled, far from it. So now is the time, the statement went on to say, to affirm not only the immorality of the use of nuclear weapons, but the immorality of their possession, thereby clearing the road to nuclear abolition. And then Pope Francis, on the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima, put it plainly, and we have a sign to this. Mr. Coghlan very generously produced and put up a sign in front of Our Lady of Guadalupe Church in Santa Fe, that the possessing of nuclear weapons is immoral. We have his image and that quote in front of that church. This is for us a very significant moment. For us, Pope Francis has said clearly that there are no more conditions, that we must be about the work of nuclear disarmament. I know that for many years, we've all heard, for example, of the just war theory. St. Augustine proposed this many centuries ago, and this has been something that I taught in the seminary almost 50 years ago, and I know this is something that is part of our tradition. But I think that when we look at nuclear armaments, especially the nuclear armaments of today, we have to say that the just war theory is no longer applicable. I hate to make militaristic metaphors, but nuclear weapons of today have blown out the theory, just war theory, out of the water. It's just not conceivable to have it anymore. For example, one of the components of the theory is that a just war can only be fought if there's a reasonable chance of success. Destroying the planet eliminates any reasonable chance of success. Furthermore, this component states that deaths and injury incurred in a hopeless cause are not morally justifiable. Again, destroying the planet is the ultimate hopeless cause. Another component of the just war theory is stated that it is to reestablish peace. But how can you reestablish peace in a thermonuclear war? It's impossible. There's nothing left to establish. Another component says that violence must be proportionate to the injury suffered. Thermonuclear war is never proportionate. And finally, another component, weapons used in war must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. Civilians are never permissible targets of war. Again, it's impossible to distinguish in a nuclear war between combatants and innocent civilians. Sadly, we're seeing this played out in conventional weapons in Ukraine today, tragically and most pathetically and deeply sadly. Even deeper for us, from our tradition, our faith tradition and faith, nonviolence and peace demand that we move beyond war in the first place. This is something that I think is logical. I think any normal person of goodwill would logically concede that we must get rid of nuclear armaments, that this is a threat to our very existence. But this goes beyond even logic. This is a moral imperative. The gospel of Christ demands that we embrace the teachings of peace. Love of enemy is one of the hardest of the gospel imperatives, and yet our Lord made no bones about it. Martin Luther King, I think, spoke about this. He was accused, as many are, of being a hopeless idealist. But Martin Luther King said that Christ was not a hopeless idealist. He was not an impractical idealist. He was the practical realist, because our Lord knew that those who live by the sword die by the sword. When the disciples wanted to call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans, Jesus rebuked them and they went away. When our Lord approached Jerusalem in his ultimate death, he broke down in tears, saying, "If today you had only understood the things that make for peace." I think that that message is so relevant for us today. If we could only understand the things that make for peace. I think Jay is going to speak about this whole notion, that this argument we hear today, that in light of the Ukraine war, that this is an argument for building up our nuclear armaments. Quite the opposite. This is a precise argument for nuclear disarmament. We're called to be peacemakers. I think, too, another point that I would make is that, as a very trenchant argument, and that is that nuclear disarmament from a gospel perspective is something that is important because the money that we use, the billions and even trillions of dollars used for nuclear arms, is money that is not being spent on those who are poor and needy, living on the periphery without medical attention, and all of those things that human beings deserve. President Eisenhower, interestingly, said many years ago that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. I'm conscious of the time, so I have other quotes, but I just want to say that the Holy See also spoke to this, that for decades, the cost of the nuclear polyarchy to the world's poor has been evident. 50 years ago, the Second Vatican Council declared that the arms race, the nuclear arms race, is an utterly treacherous trap for humanity and one which injures the poor to an incredible degree. And Pope Francis picked up on this theme in 2019 when he declared in Nagasaki, witnessing the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences of the nuclear attack, that our attempts to speak out against the arms race will never be enough. The arms race wastes precious resources that could be better used to benefit the integral development of peoples and to protect the natural environment. In a world where millions of children and families live in inhumane conditions, the money that is squandered and the fortunes made through the manufacture, upgrading, and maintenance of sale of ever more destructive weapons are an affront that cry out to heaven. It is my hope, therefore, in this pastoral letter, to rejuvenate and to sustain and to amplify a conversation about nuclear disarmament in our communities, in our state, our country, and our world. This is extremely urgent. The present state of the world is shouting out to us about this urgency. When Putin talked about putting his nuclear arsenal on alert, a chill went up my spine. I went back to when I was 12 years old, living in San Francisco in Daly City, across the highway from a Nike missile site. They weren't nuclear at that time, I don't believe, but that was the latest thing in warfare at the time. And I can remember looking up at the sky and another chill went up my spine as a little child, worrying that they were Russian planes, worrying if we were going to be bombarded because we lived so close to the Nike missile site. And so meetings such as this one that we're having tonight and that you good people have so much and are so dedicated to are so important to keep the conversation going. I applaud you for your efforts, and I look forward to working with you in the future in any way that we can as an archdiocese promote this conversation and achieve eventual nuclear disarmament and a world devoted to peace. A bishop friend of mine who's passed away, Bishop Kenny Untner, was a wonderful bishop. He was very much dedicated to social justice. And he was in Saginaw, Michigan. And he was very creative. He was very bold. And he initiated in his diocese of Saginaw a very concentrated effort to help the poor. And he mandated throughout the diocese that all diocesan meetings, all parishes, all schools, all their meetings had to begin with a prayer, and then they had to look at their agenda. And they had to make sure that every point on their agenda had something to do with the poor. And if it didn't, they were to eliminate it or to reconfigure it so that somehow or other it had something to do with the poor. I believe that for me, this is a very good idea. And I intend to commit myself each day to say, what am I going to do today to make this world a more peaceful place? It may be to say a prayer. It may be calling a friend and talking about the need for nuclear disarmament. It may be calling to some of my friends, of whom I have more than just a handful, who are for nuclear buildups and who would be at the forefront of this. It may be folding this cause into a sermon, or maybe writing my legislators, or studying the issue of nuclear disarmament, or joining groups such as yours, or NukeWatch of New Mexico, or pulling my money out of investment companies that support nuclear weapons and war making in general. or following the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. I can. Or finding a way to support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, or talking in my community, or with my religious leaders or business leaders, or even engaging in peaceful protest. One of my friends in San Francisco, Father Louis Vitale, was arrested about, I think, 50 or 60 times when he protested at the Nevada. And I can tell you a story about that, but I don't think I have time right now. But if there's time in the Q&A, I will. I read, a while back, I read Eric Metaxas's book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, and Spy. He was a wonderful Lutheran minister and priest and pastor. It was an engaging book, and I believe that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a true saint. It's attributed to him this quote: "The silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act." I applaud you, and I pray that together this vital conversation will lead to tangible results that we can all live with. We must not be silent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Archbishop. We're going to go to, we have a few questions in the chat, and I'll read them to you. We have a fantastic turnout with 118 people, so I appreciate people putting a Q or question mark. It makes it easier to find it. So the first question comes from Marcy, and she asks if you will contact the Pope and ask him to speak with President Biden and urge him to cut the nuclear weapons budget and work towards disarmament.
I will do that. I'm not in the custom of speaking to the Pope, but I'll tell you, Jay and I and other people on my writing committee for the pastoral letter, we have sent the letter to the Pope. So we've, through backdoor channels, I have some friends in Rome, and I have every reason to believe the Pope has seen the pastoral letter. We've just mailed it to the nuncio in Washington, D.C. last week, and he's going to put it in the diplomatic pouch. It's going to Pope Francis, to Cardinal Parolin, to Cardinal Czerny, who is now, by the way, in Ukraine, sent by the Pope to go to Ukraine to be a personal ambassador of the Pope in Ukraine itself with another cardinal, and to several others in the Vatican. So we have done that. And so I can say to the questioner, yes, I will do everything I can to promote that theme. I think that Pope Francis would be certainly very well disposed to do that. And that's a very important issue that she brings up. And I certainly will commit myself to doing my best. Yes.
All right. And in addition, Jim asked in Milwaukee, asked that you speak out against enforcing a no-fly zone because it increases the chances of us entering in a broader war and a nuclear engagement.
To speak out against creating a no-fly zone?
A no-fly zone.
So the questioner is saying that he's in favor of
No, he wants you to speak. He asks if you will speak out against the no-fly zone because that would lead us to an engagement.
Right. I have that same opinion, and I know that the United States, from what I can tell, and certainly the European Union, and I know that is our stand, and I agree that it would be, that could, especially with the what will I say, the unease that Mr. Putin has put us all in with some of his comments, that would be a terrible thing. It's a very tragic reality we're in, though, because I know that President Zelensky has asked for NATO to do this, but I know that would be just very difficult. So yes, I favor the question. I favor that, and I would certainly speak in favor of against the no-fly zone. Sadly, I realize how awful this is, but it's the world we live in.
Yes. Let's see. Danette asks, I know you're not a negotiator, but maybe you have an answer. How do you negotiate with a madman who bombs children's hospitals and disguises IEDs as toys? He doesn't negotiate.
That's true. This is one of the, and I think, again, this is such an important argument, and Mr. Coghlan and so many others, and I know you all have made this argument for many decades and for a long time, that, you know, if you think about it, our world, in a sense, at least in my opinion, and this is for me looking at it as a private citizen, you know, our world hangs in a balance. And really, it's, you know, a madman who has his finger on the nuclear buttons, you know, could really conceivably destroy our world. And so this is just wrong, which is another strong argument for getting rid of such weapons. I remember a Catholic nun years ago when I was a young priest gave a talk on different, she was a scientist, a PhD in science. And she said, you know, we need to be humble as human beings, that we need to, God has given us many great capacities, but we've created a monster that we conceivably cannot control. I think it's a fiction to think that we can. And frankly, and Jay speaks more eloquently than I do, the only reason we haven't had a catastrophe in the past is really basically God's grace and luck. And so I think that, you know, this is a strong argument for, but again, how we deal with terrorists, how we deal with people who are, I think the former Secretary of Defense called him unhinged, and anyway, that's a scary but very important question.
All right, thank you. I think you covered this question pretty well. Laura asks, let me find it here. How we can gather community around this issue to work towards the abolition of nuclear weapons. I believe you gave us quite a few examples.
Well, at the end, I did in the pastoral letter give some things. And of course, we all belong to different communities, you know, religious, business, social. And I think it's something that, you know, this is hard for people, especially for introverts or for people who don't like confrontation. But I think the issue is so urgent that we just have to start bringing it up. We have to start. And I think, again, the key is to listen. I think that with our friendships, with small groups, we need to listen to people, not to argue, but to show that we're listening, and then to introduce our concerns and say, well, I hear what you're saying, but what about this? You know, what about that? And to gradually begin. I believe that the arguments that we have for nuclear disarmament are so persuasive and so solid that if we could engage people, that they would eventually listen. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that everyone's going to listen. There are people who don't want to listen, or people who don't want to be told otherwise. But I think that for those who are willing to listen, we just have to start small, and that's where it has to begin. It just has to begin. Look at President Zelensky. You know, he was a comedian, and now he's a world hero. He's a brave man, a world hero. So it begins with each of us has to just do our part, I think, and have confidence in that.
All right, thank you. Well, with President Putin threatening the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the Ukraine crisis, what role can the Treaty of Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons play?
Well, Jay perhaps will answer that much better than I, so you can maybe put a bookmark on that. But my understanding now, in the situation we're in now, is that that's, again, an argument against nuclear weapons and for disarmament, is that these treaties and agreements, you know, we have seen that Russia hasn't been all that good in keeping them. For that matter, I don't think that we have a perfect record ourselves, and many other countries don't. So I think that, you know, those treaties are important. I think we need to support them. And I think we need to do everything we can to have people sign them and keep them. But at this particular juncture, in the now moment, you know, we're in a crisis, and we have to pray that we can bring peace and then, you know, move toward these supporting of these treaties. But as you know, our own country has backed out of treaties and commitments, even the last, last administration. So I think we need to look at this very seriously.
All right, next question is from Max. He's in Baltimore, and he wants to contact Bishop Laurie in Baltimore about your work. And he'd like to know if he can let him know that you are a friend and because they want to invite him to their annual Hiroshima Nagasaki commemoration. Can you put in a good word so that he will agree to be a speaker?
I'd be happy to. Archbishop Laurie put out a pastoral letter on anti-racism a few months ago, and I know he's committed to these issues, and I'd be happy. We're sending him, I think Jay will, I can see his picture. We're sending him I'll make sure he gets a copy of the pastoral letter, and I will put that in a private note. I'll say, please, you may be asked to go to this anniversary, and I encourage you to do so. He's a wonderful man, Archbishop Laurie, and I may see. I think we're having an in-person meeting in June. I don't know when. This is probably going to be in August, I suspect, and I'll talk to them then if I see him.
All right, thank you. Our timekeeper's telling me we've reached the end of this Q&A session, but want people to know there'll be a second Q&A after Jay speaks, and then we plan to have another 20 minutes, which will also be for questions and comments. So I'll turn it back to Kathleen. Or Marcy, I'm sorry, Marcy.
Hello. I guess I have the honor here to introduce Jay Coghlan, who is the Executive Director of NukeWatch New Mexico, one of the very few really excellent watchdog groups we have here, who are watching what's going on at Los Alamos Labs. Jay has worked successfully against radioactive incineration at Los Alamos National Lab. He's worked in the Clean Air Act, Freedom of Information Act, National Environmental Policy Act lawsuits against Department of Energy. And he prompted a 2006 independent study that concluded that plutonium pits last at least a century, which refuted the NNSA's assertion that we need these new design nuclear weapons and expanded plutonium pit production. Jay's going to tell us a little more about what's going on at Los Alamos National Labs and what we are up against. And before I turn it over to Jay, I would simply like to ask everyone on this meeting, on this call, to think about actions that we can all take. As in the Archbishop rattled off a bunch of them right there. I am with the End Wars and Occupations team of our chapter of PDA. And we meet, we're going to be meeting next Wednesday at 4 o'clock. So anybody on this call who would like to join us next week can email me, and I'll put my email in the chat. And you can join us to discuss more about actions we can take, things we can do. It's going to take a lot of effort on the part of a lot of people to stop this juggernaut. So we welcome you to join us for that. And this evening, after both speakers have spoken, it's not going to be just Q&A. It's going to be kind of a brainstorming discussion, and we'd like you all to be offering ideas and suggestions to help shut down the production of more nukes and to help our goal of nuclear disarmament on our part, on the US part. So with that, I would like to welcome Jay Coghlan. Thank you, Jay, for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. Like the Archbishop, I'm embarrassed by introductions as well. But, just to mix things up, I want to start with a criticism of the Archbishop. He just blew my cover. I've intentionally stayed in the background on the pastoral letter, etc. But he's outed me now, so feel criticized, Archbishop John C. But what I want to say to the rest of you, I want you to recognize the Archbishop's courage. And the way we met was I told him that there's more money spent in his archdiocese than any other on nuclear weapons than any other diocese in the country. And he basically went, oh, really? And that led to an ongoing conversation leading to the pastoral letter. And I just think he's really brave and principled to come out so strongly in support of the ban treaty, among other things, given that Los Alamos and Sandia National Laboratories are within his diocese. So it's quite something. We've expected blowback, but haven't gotten any. The Archbishop mentioned that he has sent his pastoral letter to the Vatican. It should also be noted that it's been sent to every member of the New Mexican congressional delegation and requesting a response of some kind while we're at it. He called me a friend. I can just tell you that the Archbishop has become a really dear friend of mine. And for all the bad things you hear about the Catholic Church, you know, with the sexual abuse cases, et cetera, I can tell you the Archbishop is the real deal. He is a pious, modest, heartfelt, good man who is definitely dedicated to this cause of nuclear disarmament. So there you go, Archbishop, and thank you for being a dear friend. Now, what I'm going to do, I am somewhat of a wonky guy, and I got 24 slides that I'm going to rip through. I got to go to screen share, so bear with me. I'm at the wrong place, of course, but here we go. A lot of these slides will not take long. I'm mindful of the time. So let me rip through them. I very much like Q&A. So in a sense, regard my slides as an attempt to prompt and stimulate questions. So the main thing I want to start with, and can I have confirmation you're seeing my slides?
Yes.
Thumbs up
Yes.
on that?
Yeah,
okay.
we're seeing it.
Yeah.
I see him.
Oh, away we go then. Now, the main thing that I want to impress people upon is that we are in a new nuclear arms race. And it's only, you know, so very recently heightened by the Russian invasion in the Ukraine. You all saw that Putin, you know, ordered Russian strategic forces on a higher state of alert. Although practically speaking on the ground, that doesn't really, this is both good news and bad news. That doesn't really mean anything, but that's only because both the US's and Russia's strategic nuclear forces are always on high alert. And then adding to the nuclear arms race, as stated, these countries are all expanding their nuclear stockpiles. This includes the United Kingdom. China is radically building out its intercontinental ballistic missile force. And all of this is bound to have negative impact on Biden's pending nuclear posture review, which will set forth current US nuclear weapons policies. And with respect to the US, you know, we still have more than 3,700 active nuclear weapons. Dismantlements have crawled to a pathetic pace of like 25 warheads a year. We got more than 2,000 as a backlog to dismantle. Somebody's got to mute in the background.
Shape our lives.
Everybody please mute.
Broadcasters are there.
Tough to talk over. There we go. The US is aggressively rebuilding its stockpile with new military capabilities, is aggressively building new production plants expected to be operational until at least 2075, and is buying, procuring new heavy bombers, submarines, and ballistic and cruise missiles. A special pet peeve of mine is a lot of these projects, the costs are starting to be classified. So we don't even know how much they cost. This is particularly true of that new heavy bomber designed to replace the B-52. Now, I'll argue that the second nuclear arms race is even more dangerous than the first. as a starting matter. We don't have like the classic bipolar structure of the first Cold War, which itself creates greater unpredictability. We have increased chance of regional nuclear war, India and Pakistan being the classic case. We have possible terrorist acquisition. We have hypersonic weapons, cyber attacks, artificial intelligence. Again, all of this, I argue, makes this an even more dangerous nuclear arms race. Now, one thing I think that is crucial to do is to attack the idea that we've been spoon-fed, or I should speak for myself, ever since I was a kid, about deterrence. And the brutal fact is we've never had just deterrence, nor has Russia. In fact, we've always had a hybrid of deterrence and nuclear warfighting capabilities. And you can see the quote that came out from the Pentagon after Obama's nuclear posture review. You can expect another implementation plan or strategy after Biden does his review. But in short, you know, that's why we have thousands of weapons. It's for actual nuclear warfighting instead of just the few hundred needed for only deterrence. And then in turn, that's why we're having this aggressive proposal for expanded plutonium pit production. So speaking of this $1.7 trillion modernization program, it'll give us new intercontinental ballistic missiles, bombers, cruise missiles, submarines, new military capabilities, and a perpetual cycle of so-called life extension programs. And in short, it's nuclear weapons forever. I mentioned just some warheads right here. And you should understand that the US stockpile has already undergone a radical transformation. And this is just by the introduction of a new arming, firing, and fusing set that gives nuclear weapons a far higher degree of accuracy. And in the case of nuclear weapons, you have to think of accuracy in terms of 3 dimensions, because altitude of burst is also important, crucial even. So it turned the W76-1 into, which is a quote, small weapon, relatively 100 kilotons. It turned that into a weapon of deterrence, into a military weapon, a counterforce weapon that can attack hardened targets. At the same time, a low yield variant of the W76 has already been deployed on US strategic subs. The problem here is once there's a missile coming out of a sub, our adversary has no way of knowing whether it's a low yield or a high yield weapon. The 450 kiloton W88 is being refreshed with the new fusing set that will also give it far greater accuracy. We now have the B61-12, the world's first nuclear smart bomb, entering full-scale production. And by the way, its express purpose is to be forward deployed in Europe against the Russians, and the Russians know that. The final weapon I'm touching upon right now is this new cruise missile warhead that'll be the perfect first strike weapon, because cruise missiles can hug topography, fly under radar, can be the literal bolt out of the blue. So everybody's at fault here, all of the nuclear weapons powers, and just know that in part, it's the US modernization program that is driving the new nuclear arms race. Now, with respect to new production plants, you can roughly divide nuclear weapons components into thirds. There's the non-nuclear components. It's all the fuses, parachutes, permissive action links, radars, etc. Then you got the plutonium components. Then you got the uranium components. So the US is building out production plants, new production plants in all 3 categories of nuclear weapons components. And we even have the Kansas City plant now boasting on its website that it's the busiest it's ever been in 30 years, cranking out 100,000 components per year for all of these life extension programs. Now here, one picture is worth 10,000 words. Here's Los Alamos' central mission in its own words. This comes from an internal slideshow of the laboratory. Here gives you, I'm of the Watergate School of Politics, which is to say, follow the money. Note that out of Los Alamos' annual $4 billion budget, nearly $3 billion alone is for core nuclear weapons research and production programs, while all of the remainder either directly or indirectly supports nuclear weapons programs. So the next time you hear fluff from the Los Alamos Lab, remember this. Briefly put on a plutonium pit, it's sometimes also known as the trigger because it's now the first stage that induces fusion in the second stage. But it should be known that a plutonium pit is an atomic weapon in its own right. After all, that's what destroyed Nagasaki. Now I get into why expanded pit production is not necessary. If there's any takeaway that you should take from this presentation on pit production itself, in my opinion, it should be there is no pit production scheduled to maintain the safety and reliability of the existing nuclear weapons stockpile. And please note, the existing nuclear weapons stockpile has been proven to be reliable. It has been full-scale tested over 1,000 times. As stated here, there's already 15,000 pits stored at the Pantex plant. A 2006 independent study concluded pits last at least a century. The Livermore lab went on to say more like 150 years. The average age now, by the way, is around 40 years. And the first new pits to be produced will be heavily modified, in the words of the weaponeers, W87-like, indicating that the design could be radically changed. The problem with that is a pit has to implode almost perfectly symmetrically for it to work. That's why we've had more than 1,000 full-scale tests. So to introduce heavily modified pits could actually degrade confidence in the stockpile. In the worst case, it could even prompt the US back into full-scale testing, which obviously would have severe international proliferation consequences. Now, to get to current plans, I want to pick on the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is the semi-autonomous nuclear weapons agency within the Department of Energy. But, just for starters, the Department of Energy itself has been on the Government Accountability Office high risk list for project mismanagement, fraud, waste of taxpayers' money for 27 consecutive years. So that's just like a baseline. But nevertheless, NNSA wants to produce 30 or more pits per year at LANL by 2030. Or actually, that's wrong. That's by 2026. It's 50 or more pits per year at Savannah by 2030. There's a high chance that pit production will fail at Savannah River, which could have a boomerang effect on Los Alamos to produce 80 pits per year with so-called surge capacity. The total estimated cost of pit production is $43 billion over 30 years, but that estimate was made in 2018. And there has been no overall cost estimate since then that I know of, and I think I would know. So for starters, there should be a new cost estimate. Congress should demand that. I point to the chronic nuclear safety infractions at Atlanta. There's an article in the New Mexican Today towards that end, where 3 workers were contaminated. At the proposed pit production facility at the Savannah River site in South Carolina, they're repurposing a building that was it was the so-called MOX or mixed oxide program that was going to, quote, burn plutonium in commercial reactors as a way to get rid of it. But it was a real boondoggle. The new estimate just to repurpose that facility is doubled to 11 billion. And in all, that's going to be a $20 billion facility. And by way of comparison, the new World Trade Center cost 4 billion. So the prices, the costs are just crazy. Obviously, future pit production, you know, besides the policy and the nuclear arms race danger, obviously it has environmental and waste impacts. You can see that close to 60,000 cubic meters of transuranic waste will be produced over 50 years. On an interesting note, be aware that there are strong proposals to expand the mission of the waste isolation pilot plant in southern New Mexico. And I note how convenient it is to have both pit production and the dump for pit production waste all in the same poor state. But according to the NNSA, more than half of future capacity at WIP will be reserved for pit production and given priority over the present cleanup mission. Now, what activists have done so far, and I'm mindful, Marcy wanted me to pitch things towards what we can do, which is, of course, the practical point. And towards that end, look at what we've done in the past. NNSA has tried 4 times through National Environmental Policy Act processes to expand pit production, and we beat them each time. And in one programmatic environmental impact statement, this was in 2008, but the larger community generated over 100,000 public comments and virtually overwhelmingly against expanded pit production. So NNSA declined at that time, but clearly now is by far their most serious attempt that's already being undertaken. Do note that NukeWatch, with 2 of our collegial organizations, that's SRS Watch and Tri-Valley Cares. Obviously, SRS Watch is at the Savannah River site. Tri-Valley Cares is kind of like NukeWatch's counterpart at the Livermore Lab. But we have sued the NNSA to get a programmatic environmental impact statement. NNSA filed a motion to dismiss. We believe will survive that motion to dismiss and hopefully go on to a court-ordered, a court order that NNSA must complete a programmatic EIS, that is to say, a national study on pit production required by the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, we're given so few tools to grapple with policy. And unfortunately, the National Environmental Policy Act, besides electing the right politicians, which generally doesn't happen, NEPA is one of the few tools available to us. And, you know, to state the obvious, it should analyze the heavy plutonium contamination already at Los Alamos Lab. And of course, the former Rocky Flats plant was heavily contaminated. DOE intends to do what I call a Rocky Flats style cleanup of Los Alamos, which is to cap and cover some, can you believe this number? Some nearly 1 million cubic yards of radioactive and toxic waste. Just cap and cover, leave them permanently buried, like 3 miles uphill from the Rio Grande and above our common groundwater. Plutonium has already been detected, like some even up to 500 feet below these waste dumps, and groundwater is between 800 to 1,000 feet below. So basically, further contamination of the groundwater aquifer is inevitable. And then again, I point to chronic unresolved nuclear safety problems, both at Rocky Flats and Los Alamos. And how safe will it be at the Savannah River site, which, by the way, PIP production, although Savannah River has tons and tons of plutonium, it's never actually done plutonium PIP production. On a new LANL site-wide environmental impact statement, the last one was in 2008, and it goes without saying that much has changed since then, including expanded PIP production. I get into a lot of NEPA procedures here, but the updates that NNSA has done to date are sorely inadequate. Here we have some of the changed circumstances. One thing I particularly want to point out is that third bullet, that potential radioactive doses calculated by the safety board are orders of magnitude above Department of Energy calculated doses. And in fact, the safety board calculated potentially lethal doses to workers at Los Alamos. This essentially stems from the incompatibility of mixed wastes at Los Alamos, which is not theoretical because it was a drum of waste sent by Los Alamos to the waste isolation pilot plant that ruptured on Valentine's Day 2014 and closed WIP for 3 years, costing some $2 billion to reopen. So when it comes to these documents that NNSA should do under the National Environmental Policy Act, a real important item is that the public insists on credible calculated doses instead of the, unsurprisingly incredibly low doses that DOE calculates. Then we have the matter of wildfires. As you know, Los Alamos has suffered 2 major wildfires. And moving to the next slide, site-wide EISs are good for the lab and good for the public. It was in response to a 1999 Los Alamos site-wide EIS that DOE actually undertook fire mitigation measures. And lo and behold, 6 months later, the 2000 Cerro Grande fire burned within a half mile of Area G that at the time had some 40,000 barrels of plutonium contaminated waste above ground. And I don't think I engage in hyperbole when I say it could have been catastrophic had those drums burst with respirable plutonium across northern New Mexico. And even Los Alamos itself recognized the value of public comment. And here I just point out some local institutions that have passed resolutions requesting that NNSA complete a LANL site-wide EIS. The Buckman Direct Diversion Project Board, by the way, that is the project that directly diverts drinking water from the Rio Grande. And they got skin in the game because just upriver is Los Alamos Canyon, which is known for transporting plutonium contamination into the Rio. So finally, getting to what you can do. And I do hope to expand upon this in Q&A. First of all, I invoke the cliche of the Chinese word for crisis, so I'm told, that are the Chinese care. So opportunity, and professional media people I know are able to track that the public's interest in nuclear weapons issues is not surprisingly up tenfold right now. So in short, we do have the public's attention on these matters. And I very much want to suggest that this is a very opportune time for us to get our message, get our advocacy out, and get our actions out. I'm going to make a general statement. I could get to specifics later, but it's critical that Congress hears dissenting voices. And I don't doubt that a number of you are probably jaded. I confess to being periodically jaded myself, thinking that it won't do that much good, to convey our opinions to the New Mexico congressional delegation. But shaking that off, I repeat, it's crucial to do that. They need to hear a constant drumbeat of dissenting voices. And I argue for particularly focusing on Heinrich. He used to be on Senate Armed Services Committee. He's now on Senate Energy and Water Appropriations, which is what actually funds the DOE nuclear weapons programs. And this is the essential plum assignment for New Mexico senators. He was preceded by Domenici and Udall, and that's the catbird seat from which he can shovel money to the labs. I go on, the public and we should demand comprehensive cleanup and expanded non-proliferation programs, not more bombs, and do gear up for the midterm elections. The outcome will be critical. That's not quite as true of New Mexico. In other states, the midterm elections are going to be critical. I proudly state that a pox on both political parties, but I can tell you from my personal experience, this won't surprise you. It's really important who controls Congress, and it's a lot tougher dealing with the committees when they're controlled by the Republicans. Continuing with what you can do, don't neglect the mundane. Write the letters to the editors, the op-eds, etc. Pressure the New Mexico delegation to support a LANL site-wide EIS. NukeWatch and others, within a month, I expect to come out with a letter demanding a LANL site-wide EIS. And we would very much welcome organizational sign-ons. And then if and when, I want to emphasize when, I think we'll get them, engage in the NEPA processes for both the nationwide programmatic EIS and the Los Alamos site-wide EIS. And then finally, I'm going to close with this, but again, look forward to Q&A. Support local efforts to support the ban treaty. Bill Tewald with Veterans for Peace made me aware that the Albuquerque City Council is considering a memorial towards that end on March 21st. I'm proud to report to you that Archbishop Wester says he's going to support that. I suggest that you all should as well. I'm not quite ready to do so yet, but I intend to take this up with the Santa Fe City Council and the Santa Fe County Commission as well. So when we have the federal government, including Congress, largely arrayed against us, and we have the New Mexico congressional delegation largely arrayed against us, let's go local. Let's get the city and county governments to support memorials, resolutions, et cetera, on the ban treaty. And with that, I will close. I think I did a decent job of coming in on time, I believe, and look forward to Q&A. I'm going to quit screen sharing and we'll take it from there.
All right. Thank you, Jay. I'm trying to get, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 questions here. Let's see if we can get through those in 10 minutes. And so let me just review what the remaining schedule is for people here. And I wanted to check with the Archbishop if you're going to be able to stay. I know you each wanted to do a 5-minute closing, and we plan to have this 10-minute Q&A and then follow that with a 20-minute Q&A and discussion. But keeping in mind, we have over 100 people. It's going to be a challenge. And I want to remind people, there's an invitation for Marcy to join in a follow-up meeting next week, and she will put her email in the chat, and please contact her through her email, letting her know you want to be invited to that meeting, and that's for anyone across the country. So I think I'll start with one of the last questions, because people want to know what a pit is, and someone put in that it's named after the hard core found in fruits such as peaches and apricots, but it's not, obviously not that. So if you want to just quickly answer that, and then I will go back to the top with the other questions. Jay?
Yeah, I'll start with what a pit is not. I went to Russia, I think it was in 2006, with a pit fact sheet translated by the Russian professor at UNM. And she mistakenly translated pit as a hole in the ground or a shaft. So all of a sudden I looked up at a very puzzled Russian audience. So it's not that, it's not a hole in the ground. It's like the pit of a peach. I no doubt was a bit too fast with my slides. But if you recall that schematic, the plutonium pit was basically at the center of the weapon, of the warhead. Again, it's often called the trigger because it induces fusion in the secondary, which creates the gigantic yields of modern thermonuclear weapons. So again, it is the core, like a pit, nuclear weapons component. And it's also, I should add, it's always been the bottleneck of resumed US industrial scale nuclear weapons production. NNSA has always had a hard time. The head of the Pentagon calls pit production the #1 modernization issue. So here too is opportunity. We here in New Mexico have the privilege of combating pit production, the crucial issue in US modernization. So I submit this is a direct way for us as New Mexicans to address the accelerating global nuclear weapons arms race.
Okay, thank you. Derek asks, please address the threat of lowering the threshold with low yield nukes.
Fairly easy to do. There's an argument that the bigger weapons are self-deterring. They're just too big and nobody in their right mind would use them. That W76-2 that I mentioned that was last year rushed and deployed on strategic submarines is arguably simply more usable, a lower yield. Generally the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs are regarded as having yields of between 12 to 18 kilotons. That W76-2 could have a yield as low as 0.3 kilotons, so very small for a nuclear weapon, that is. But the temptation to use it could be quite high. As I did state, one problem with it is the target, once it sees that missile, will have no way of knowing whether it's a low yield or a high yield warhead coming towards them.
That's important. You may have answered this, I'm not sure. If the pits are not at their end of their life, then why are we making new ones?
Well, as I said, if there's any takeaway point, take home point, I hope you all take specifically on PIP production, it is that the US has no PIP production scheduled to maintain the existing nuclear weapons stockpile. So then the corollary is, what are these new pits for? They are for new design nuclear weapons. And this is part and parcel of what the weapons labs want to do. They always want to be on the cutting edge of nuclear weapons design. That's what's sexy. That's where the prestige is. That's where the money is, et cetera, et cetera. Cleanup is kind of mundane compared to that. So these new pits are for new design nuclear weapons. That's beyond dispute. As I mentioned, the problem is that could degrade confidence in the stockpile. It could conceivably, in the extreme, it could even push the US back into resuming testing, after which the whole world would go nuts. Everybody would start to test.
Right. How do we deal with countries that have developed small nuclear weapon arsenals, deter larger nations such as ourselves from attacking them, most likely with conventional weapons?
How do we deter them? You know, in a lot of ways, I regard this as the nut of the problem. I do want to echo the Archbishop. I very much share the view that the present crisis in Ukraine, rather than arguing for the continuing preservation of nuclear weapons, instead argues for their complete elimination. There is definitely an argument going around nowadays in the neocon circles that the fact that Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons demonstrates the dangers of doing so, with Russia now invading it. To begin to counter that with just one brief point, they were never Ukrainian weapons. They weren't theirs to keep. They were Soviet weapons placed on Ukrainian soil, and also Belarus and Kazakhstan, by the way. They were under Soviet command and control. The Ukrainians had neither the infrastructure nor the real high authority expertise to deal with them. So just with that as a baseline, but I would say this gives more weight to the argument that mad men, and I do disparage my own gender, by the way, but mad men should not be allowed to have pretty much sole use of nuclear weapons. And you can point to Putin, or you could point to Trump, who, recall a couple of years ago, threatened North Korea with, what was the quote? I may not have it exactly right, but hellfire and fury like you've never seen. So again, let's use this, you know, I'm going to say crisis / opportunity to argue for total nuclear disarmament. We're going to have to get technical about it at some point. I'm not going to do it now. But one thing I will say that the labs can and should do is offer the hardware, the technological underpinnings for having a future world free of nuclear weapons that is the monitoring and accounting technologies that we're really going to need to help ensure a nuclear weapons free world. So there actually is something positive that the labs could do in addition to cleanup.
Okay. Let's see. All right, more questions have been coming in.
Give me a hard one. Give me a hard question.
Well, this one what should we, I don't know if this is hard. This probably isn't hard, but it's the next one. What should we know about hypersonic weaponry?
Hypersonic weapons are a term of art, generally regarded as, and also they're generally, when it comes to nuclear weapons, there could be hypersonic platforms, delivery systems for nuclear weapons in this context. They can also just be kinetic, just boom, something hits you at Mach 5. So hypersonic weapons are regarded as being Mach 5, that is to say, 5 times the speed of sound. So to state the obvious, they're fast. They're also maneuverable. They don't follow a fixed trajectory like a ballistic missile would do so. So they're virtually indefensible, cannot be defended against. It's known that China is engaged pretty heavily, somewhat aggressively in hypersonic weapons. So there's been proof of concept, but as far as I know, not actual any mating of nuclear weapons to them. But just to emphasize what I said, how the second nuclear arms race is even more dangerous than the first, this is yet another dimension, along with artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, etc., that we have to deal with. The Archbishop said it, and for that matter, Robert McNamara said it. We survived Armageddon in the past only by sheer luck and God's grace. And now we have even more complicating factors. Again, leading to the argument for total nuclear disarmament. This is not a Pollyanna or feel-good matter. We need to eliminate nuclear weapons for the benefit of all, because the possession of them by anybody is a threat to all.
All right, I think this may be a good follow-up to your response you just gave. So if we have a nuclear weapons ban, how do we ensure that all of these weapons are taken out of use or storage, and that some are not held in secret by some nations?
Okay, that's a hard question I was asking for. I don't have any complete silver bullet for it. I've already said this is an area in which the labs could really contribute. I'm told that there are some classified programs, non-proliferation programs, that would surprise you with remote sensing of both warheads and special nuclear materials. This has to do with basically neutron counting, and neutrons are very hard to shield. So therefore offers some hope for detectability. There has to be many arrows in that quiver. It has to be political, technical, and accounting matter, economic, the threat of sanctions. I mean, my nightmare is just what the questioner asked. How do you make sure that somebody has not hidden some nuclear weapons? So I don't have all of the answers to this. What I would like to do is offer what I think is one very solid, credible provisional step, and that is to come down, for starters, to minimal deterrence. That is to say, just a couple of hundred weapons to do what we've all been spoon-fed all our lives, that it's just deterrence. So let's actually do what we say, come down to a couple of hundred weapons, and then look up and figure the rest out. So that's the best answer that I can come up with for the time being. But let's at least start on that road. We're going backwards. is what's happening right now. Let's go forward.
Mhm. All right, there's a question and then the answer is in the chat, but so I'm just going to read it. How many schools and hospitals could be built if we diverted just 1 year's of NNSA budget? And Marcy comes in with the answer. The cost to make one plutonium pit is 50 million. That's 667 teachers' salaries. We could, and also we could eliminate hunger in America for 25 billion.
And we're looking at a $1.7 trillion modernization program.
Okay, let me see. We got. We're just going to take a couple more, and then I think because we're going over time, we're going to need to decide when we do the closing remarks from our speakers. And I'm just feeling with this many people on that probably doing the ideas for action and planning is really going to have to be followed up next week with those that are interested in participating in that. So if Marcy or Lisa, if you want to chime in on that, I'm just looking at the time. Let's see, I'm gonna. 23. What about the seismic risk at Los Alamos, which sits on an earthquake fault line?
What was the question, ma'am?
What about the seismic risk of an earthquake?
Yeah.
In Los Alamos?
Yeah, seismic, there are seismic risks at Los Alamos. If you can picture the mountains immediately to the west of the lab, the Rendija fault runs at the base of those mountains. And then I believe that it was Corrales had I think it was a 5 magnitude earthquake in 1910. Don't quote me on that, but in short, yes, there is seismic activity. It of course is nothing like there is for the Livermore lab, which is just east of the Bay Area. But it is a concern. Los Alamos appears to have taken care of some business by seismically retrofitting the PIP production facility. They were in a world of hurt about that for quite a while, but it looks like they've undertaken steps to seismically shore that facility up. It's NukeWatch, we are not seismic experts, but frankly, we used to be much more concerned about it. We thought it was a real vulnerability for the lab's programs and especially PIP production. The old CMR building, if you're at all familiar with that, was essentially closed down because of the seismic risk. But right now, we don't think that that is a really ripe area that we can exploit.
And to that, Grace in South Carolina says that there's also seismic risks at SRS as well.
Pat,
Well,
I'd like to address your question about the schedule for the remaining 16 minutes.
Yes.
And Lisa, so we were going to have some closing comments, as you mentioned, by both speakers, and some open Q&A. Do we want to bring Archbishop back in for open QA for a period so that both speakers can address any questions for a short period and then have the closing comments? Or I'm open to what you want to all suggest.
I
Yeah,
suggest bringing the Archbishop back.
All
yeah,
right.
I suggest doing that.
Get off the hot seat there.
And I'm going to go back up to the top. That was a question for either one of you. So Let me get that.
And just so you know too,
What-
I don't have 5 minutes of closing comments, so you can factor that into your.
Okay. So this question is for either one of you. What should the US, the EU, and the rest of the world be doing to stop the murder of Ukrainians? It's a hard question.
Yeah, that's a tough question for all of us, right, really, but I think that, I think we're certainly, in my estimation, I think the EU and the United States and other countries are doing everything they can. I think private businesses are pitching in more than anybody ever anticipated. I think even more than we anticipated. Private businesses are pulling out, banning oil products from Russia. I mean, all these things I think are signs and symbols, as I mentioned, our own Pope Francis has sent 2 cardinals into the Ukraine itself. And I'm sure there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that we're not even aware of right now. I pray there are. So I think for us as ordinary citizens, just to keep voicing our, again, it's so powerful. When we had our meeting today, one of our members had on the Zoom backboard, you can put those backdrops on. She had, a little dove and saying, we support Ukrainians. And I think certainly, I think also direct aid, for all of us to pitch in and to give direct aid to those agencies that are receiving over 2 million or more now refugees. These are forced immigrants, refugee asylum seekers. And so I think do everything we can to help them and to, and for our country and all the other countries to give people temporary TPS, temporary protected status, so that they can get in and to get rid of all the blockades to people, to do away with those on an emergency basis. These are all things we can do to help the refugees, and then just to keep advocating, world leaders to keep putting pressure on Russia to come to a quick end. I think Putin, obviously, there was a good article in the New York Times last night. He could take have some lose some face and cut his losses now. Probably he won't do that. He's going to double down, as seems to be his MO, and have more serious losses in the future. And nonetheless, I think we just have to keep analyzing it and doing our best to put pressure on them.
Yes.
I'll be brief. I think Biden's doing a pretty good job right now. I'm especially pleased that he didn't go macho and respond to Putin by upping the US's alert. So that's a good thing. And make no mistake, I condemn the Russian invasion in the strongest possible terms and salute the heroism of the Ukrainian people. That said, Russian security concerns should be addressed and resolved. I'm, of course, pointing to NATO expansionism ever since 1991. I'll inject that does not justify Russian invasion, but those concerns should be met. I would also say that the US history of trashing treaties, period, and in this case, arms control treaties, that's got to stop. I personally think that the new nuclear arms race started when Bush Jr. walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. So what should be done? Again, I think Biden's doing a pretty good job right now with the immediate crisis in Ukraine. But I point to the obvious, the US needs to clean up its act as well. And above all, let's get everybody to dampen down the accelerating nuclear arms race. This is nuts.
All right. I'm going to just ask one more question, and then I think if Lloyd, there's a lot of good comments and notices about meetings and such in the chat. So if after this next question, Lloyd could tell people how to copy the chat if they want that information.
Yes,
And-
and we'll be saving the chat as well.
Yes,
Okay.
good.
And then, so the final question is going to be, how do anti-nuke activist groups prepare for and counter the so-called nuclear clean energy corporate interests?
I guess I'll address that. Y'all are aware that for the first time in history, a commercial reactor was militarily attacked by Russian forces in Ukraine. And the latest I heard is that they're going after a second one. That right there illustrates, the dangers involved with nuclear energy. The Russian nuclear energy program is a lot more intertwined with its weapons program than the American programs are. But I don't deal with nuclear energy issues per se. But over the decades, I have grown more staunchly anti-nuclear energy. It is not the green industry. It is not the carbon-free emissions industry they pretend to be. When you look at the initial mining and milling cycle, which requires a lot of electricity, and obviously they've never solved the end, that being the waste problem. And in this case, this is a case in which I would argue for free market capitalism, because the nuclear energy industry in the US would collapse overnight without taxpayer subsidies. And the so-called renaissance of the nuclear energy is proved false. So nuclear energy is going to die of its own accord, I'm pleased to report. It may take a little while, and kind of only China is really keeping it alive at the moment. But it'll eventually go away. One interesting note is an American lieutenant general who headed up, I don't know, one of the Iraq wars, noted if there's a silver lining to the present crisis in Ukraine, if there is one, it could be that it forces Europe to go renewables. And that's an interesting thought.
All right.
Pat, this is Lisa.
Yes.
We have about eight or 9 minutes right now. Would it be possible to go ahead and have some kind of closing comments? It would be amazing to hear how you can close this conversation that we've had in a short time, but some direction to pulling it all together for us from both of our speakers, and then realize how absolutely critical it is that we take any number of actions that we have been advised on like tonight. There will be more opportunities if we go to the meeting next Wednesday that Marcy has planned at 4 o'clock. So please save the chat and pull out the information that you want. There's a lot of their ideas on that chat as well. So the critical thing from the whole program to me is that we have to act, and very few of us have the knowledge that our two presenters had tonight, but you've given us ways to support what you're doing. You've given us ways to understand how critical it is. And we've got to find our own ways of many opportunities to do our actions. And I know this is Marcy's critical issue here, is that we can't just listen to this and let it go. So please, if you would, our speakers, if you would try to give some kind of closing comments to us, and then everybody hold on to all the ideas that you've heard regarding how we can each act on these issues. Thank you.
Okay, do you want me to go, Jay?
Yes, please.
Just in closing, first of all, to express gratitude to you all. I'm very impressed by you all, and very impressed by what I've heard tonight, and to wish you all the best in all your activities. I think, and this ties in a little bit about what we were just been talking about, to my mind, with our country and Russia and accords and all this. I think that we've got to start realizing, if you want to do it from a religious point of view, that, we're all God's children. And all of us are, if you want to do it from just a humanistic point of view, we're all living on the planet Earth together and one human family. And we've got to stop treating each other like we're enemies. We've got to start talking to one another and listening to one another. A small little example, I'll confess on myself, and Jay won't mind, I don't think. When I gave a talk at the Roundhouse several years ago on this very topic, Jay attended it, and I didn't know him from Adam. And after the talk was over, he came up to me and he said, "I'd like to talk to you." And my first impression was, oh boy, here's one of these radical, guys. And so later on, when I shared that with Jay, he said, "Well, you were right. I am radical." And as you can see, he is radical, and thank God we have him. I mean, every time I listen to him, I learn something different. But my point is that, I had immediately pigeonholed him and thought, okay, here, we've got to stop doing that. And I know this is another thing that alarms me. I know that Russia's becoming a pariah nation now, and everybody's angry, and that's understandable. Watching this human suffering, is very understandable. But I think we have to guard against that, making them out to be the enemy. We're all against Russia, et cetera. We've got to start finding ways to communicate. I think that's, from my perspective, what Pope Francis is trying to do, talking about the bloodbath that's taking place in Ukraine right now. We've got to start talking and relying on diplomacy. And as Jay said earlier, we've got to stop backing out of agreements. We have to start, putting our money where our mouth is. We have to start really investing in that dialogue and trusting one another and listening to one another and talking to one another. And I think we have to learn to be better listeners. I think that's true of our country, which is highly polarized right now. It's true of our world. So I would just hope that nuclear disarmament, this conversation is going to require listening and learning and treating each other as brothers and sisters and not as enemies.
Jay.
I'll close first by noting the Mutual Admiration Society that the Archbishop and I have. This is unprecedented what he's doing to really weigh in spiritually and coming almost, probably the wrong word to use, but with evangelical fervor in this matter. But I really think the Archbishop's pastoral letter is going to endure over time and have ongoing ramifications. So to the extent that you all could help amplify that pastoral letter, that would be a good thing. And then keeping Marcy in mind, when she initially contacted, she emphasized that I should emphasize action, which of course is right. I would like to point to the resolution or the memorial that the Albuquerque City Council will be considering on, it was March 21st, if I remember correctly. So there is a good specific action that those of you within Albuquerque could undertake. I'd like to see that replicated in Santa Fe City and County. There's no move yet towards that end. I'm going to repeat some of the things I previously said. Make your views known to the New Mexico congressional delegation. I didn't have time to get into a lot of New Mexico specifics, but do know that 40% of the National Nuclear Security Administration's annual nuclear weapons budget, and obviously that's a nationwide budget, 40% of it is spent in New Mexico alone. That's because of the two labs. So it's absolutely crucial that New Mexicans get to their congressional delegation, who have a history of, going over decades of being very subservient to the nuclear weapons industry. So do take action. I will just close by observing, for the third time, This crisis in Ukraine is opportunity. It does not present a legitimate argument for more nuclear weapons. It presents a compelling argument for their total eradication. And that's what we should set out to do. And I'm very pleased by the turnout. So thank you all.
Thank you, Jay. And I did want to mention a number of things. A lot of people asked if this meeting is being recorded, and the answer is yes. It will be posted on the PDA website, and I put the link to the website in the chat window. For those of you that don't have access to the chat window, it's PDACNM.org. So it takes about 3 to 5 days to go through the process of getting the recording and getting it loaded up to the site. And a number of people have asked if the slideshow that you use, Jay, would be available. Is that something
Yes.
you share with people?
Yes, thank you for asking.
I can send you my email and you could provide it to me if you want to, and then we can put it on a shared Google Drive with a link from the website if that sounds appropriate.
I can do that, but I'm reminded to mention the NukeWatch website at www.nukewatch.org. My presentation is not up there yet, but will be probably tomorrow.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the chat. So can you repeat that to me?
www.nukewatch.org.
Great. All right,
And I
that's in the chat as well.
hasten to add the pastoral letter is on the website of the Santa Fe Archdiocese. Also has a handy summary.
Okay.
You all should check that out.
Archbishop, do you want to post that in the chat?
Sure, let me do that.
We'll have all of those resources for everybody. And for those of you that want to save the chat, so you don't have to furiously write down notes in the chat window, if you go to the bottom of the chat window on the far right side, there's 3 dots or ellipses. If you click on those 3 dots, it gives you the option to save the chat. And what it will do is save it to some location on your hard drive or other storage device.
Jay, this is Lisa. May I ask, would it not be one of our actions to support your group that you just mentioned?
I didn't want to seem venal and mercenary, but sure, send all the money you got.
Well, again, we're looking for any number of ways to be involved, and we have to go to the experts because we are not the experts. And any way that we can support you and the Archbishop in the ways that you have brought to us, that's just one more honest way, I think, to be of help. Thank you.
You're
And since
welcome. And
we-
I just put the Archdiocesan website on the chat.
Great, thank you for that. And since we saved the chat here, as Pat had asked me, we'll be putting a lot of your questions that we didn't get to onto the website as well.
Thank you, Pat.
And I'd like to do a thank you to Pat for handling all the questions and answers so well.
Very well.
Lisa, do you want to do community announcements in closing?
I would very quickly ask if anyone is on locally here who has some community actions. We've mentioned the issue going on with the in Albuquerque and many other things going on, but is there anything more that someone might want to mention, a meeting or an opportunity that has not come up in this particular discussion that you would want the local group to know about? Is there
I
anything?
see Peter has his hand up, so
I
Peter,
don't-
can you
oh, yes,
unmute
Peter,
yourself and
please.
go?
Yes, Peter, please.
If you will allow a comment from someone from Massachusetts, we have observed what you're doing out there in New Mexico. We've been inspired by Archbishop Wester's pastoral letter and his incredibly courageous stand. We want to build an alliance between Massachusetts Peace Action and all of you folks, and between the Catholic parishes in Massachusetts, whom we're trying to rally to this cause using the Archbishop's pastoral letter. About half a dozen of my Massachusetts colleagues are on this call. You are inspiring us. Please keep it up and tell us how further we can support you.
And so I encourage you all to use either whatever means you find appropriate for reaching out to each other. But one option is to send each other private chat messages in the chat window. At the bottom of the chat window, it normally says to everyone. If you click on the down arrow next to the right of everyone, you can select a specific private recipient and exchange contact information that way if you want to. Or if you want a broader audience, you can put it to everyone. And while that's going on, I see Barbara and Bill T-Wall. Say, Bill, I think it's you. If you unmute yourself. Or if that doesn't work, I can do it for you.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, the Albuquerque chapter of the Veterans for Peace is going to have a meeting this Monday, and we're going to have, I'm trying to remember the name of our speaker. He's a frontline speaker. He is really good on Ukraine. Sally Alice, can you join me in helping me remember who we have? Or Willard or Charles?
Bruce Gagnon.
Yeah, speak.
He's the coordinator of keeping nuclear weapons and nuclear energy out of space.
And I will post the Zoom link to the PDA, and I will distribute it also through NukeWatch and other organizations. So everyone is invited Monday at 5:30, this coming Monday, to hear Bruce Gagnon.
And do you have any links or other information you would like to post into the chat window?
Not at this time.
Okay, thanks. And I see Jim from Milwaukee has his hand up.
Yeah, hi, thanks for this great presentation. Myself, Jim Carpenter and Marcy Winograd from California are co-chairs of End Wars and Occupations for PDA. We should collaborate, right, with End Wars and Occupations group from New Mexico, right? And so should I send you, Marcy, an email so we can collaborate? We have a meeting every third Saturday at noon Eastern time. And we ask PDA to send out to their emails, send emails to their membership about actions we can take. Last email we sent out was regarding calling your Congress people about not having a no-fly zone. So anyhow, should we coordinate on that, Marcy?
I think that's a great idea. I would love to coordinate with the national End Wars groups. I've been to a few of those meetings, and there's next Saturday. I don't always get the alerts. So do you have my email address there? Maybe you could just send me the Zoom link and I can.
Yeah, now I got it. Now I have it. You posted in the chat. So now I have it, and I'll send you how to get onto those calls.
Great. That would be great to have our local group coordinate with, and we can update you on all the actions we've been taking so far too.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody from across the country, to reaching out and forming stronger network to achieve these action results. And I think, Lisa, you have the ending remarks, and then I'll stop the recording so I can save it.
Well, it's hard to put anything together that's very short, but we have no time for anything longer. I think what has been shared tonight has been extraordinary. I think having the large group on was very, very extraordinary as well. There's a hunger for this need. There's a huge hunger for knowledge and for knowing what we can do. So again, I go back and back and back to saying, what actions can we take? That's what we need to take from this meeting, and to take it on to other meetings so that we can indeed help, even though we're not the experts. We have two experts with us who have given us numerous opportunities to know how to work through this issue. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, our presenters, for being here with us, giving us your evening and your expertise. It means so much to us, and we do with PDA Central New Mexico. We cannot tell you how much we appreciate your being here with us. Thank you very much.